one of the unfortunate truisms of our lives today that we rarely meet people that project, or I should rather say ooze, authenticity. That quality of being their own best self, following their instincts, their curiosities, and their obsessions, and structuring their lifestyle to continually support these things. Often today we encounter careerism instead of honesty, integrity, and a disciplined spirit of inquiry. We see work made for the media, hear language which is calibrated to intimidate, and encounter personalities shaped to ingratiate. Not tonight. As the graffiti in one of our toilets is boldly proclaiming, he's coming on November 14th. He, of course, is Dave Hickey.
Thank you very much, Coy. Now I understand why the girls jump back. They don't want to get any authenticity on them. This is more people than there are in Los Angeles who would be faintly interested in a talk on John Ruskin. But I am flattered, and thank you very much for coming. I'm going to take it as more of a proof of the relentless, occasion-oriented gregariousness of Los Angelinos, and just assume that you would have basically the same crowd at opening of a mini mall. But thank you very much for showing up. What I would like to talk about tonight, again, continuing my campaign against all that's right and decent and forward-looking, and I'd like to talk about John Ruskin, 19th century British critic, probably one of the first great cultural critics, a man of profound influence whose light has been dimmed over the years because he disagreed with almost everything that was happening during his life, and certainly with nearly everything that happened for the subsequent 90 years. But he does have a number of a good deal to offer to us today, and this lecture is really more than anything just an introduction to Ruskin, who is largely unrecognized and largely out of print today, but we deal with him and with his ideas day in and day out, and confront the problems that he confronted, and perhaps do not find better solutions, but still end up having to ask the same question. By way of give you a little quote from first, I'd like to cite a little quote from The Stones of Venice, one of Ruskin's books that I used for an introduction to an essay on James Turrell. All good architecture depends upon confusion in the midst of order, on uncertainty in the midst of decision, and mystery in the midst of trenchant lines. Ruskin was born in 1819. He was the son of John James Ruskin, who was a Scottish sherry merchant and a bourgeois man of culture, much the creature of the Romantic movement and of the Romantic poets. His mother, Margaret Ruskin, her husband's first cousin, was a devout evangelical, and Ruskin grew up in that sort of irony that is probably more typical of 17th century Dutch culture than of 19th century English, in the sense that he grew up in a very rigid, moral, very well-to-do evangelical household, and confronted the complexities of his position in society and his intellectual gifts and his privilege for his entire life. Of course, as a child, he grew up on the Bible, on an evangelical idea about the typologies of the Bible and on the principles of exegetical reading. Also grew up on Wordsworth and was a serious poet at a young age. He was a painter of considerable facility. This is all during his teens and childhood. Studied with some of the better watercolorists in England and became a quite competent artist and a successful artist as a teenager, and also showed considerable interest in geology and became actively involved in geology at this time. Of course, we're talking about the first great fashion for geological inquiry. Published his first essay on geology at the age of 15. Also, his youth was very much involved in travel. His father spent a lot of time in Europe because of his business and because of his cultural interest, and Ruskin pretty much grew up on the road, as it is, mostly in Switzerland and in Italy, and seeking out that sort of romantic environment and vista and picturesque environment that people of that time did. Went up to Oxford in 1837. 1839, he won the Newdigate Poetry Prize. And his mother, of course, wished him to go into the church. His father wished him to become a romantic poet. He became a great critic, I guess, and that's a reasonable solution between the two. Give you an idea of his sensibility. When he was at Oxford, or in summer, when he was not at Oxford, but between semesters, he was in Italy, and should kind of have a little bit more light here. Is that possible? Whoever it is that's doing the light, I'll sort of get this. Excuse me. He wrote to his father about how he felt that it was very difficult for him to become a poet, considering the life he led was too comfortable and regular and too hardening for him to be able to write first-rate verse. He says, I don't see how it is possible for a person who gets up at 4, goes to bed at 10, eats ices when he is hot and beef when he was hungry, gets rid of all claims to charity by giving money which he hasn't earned, and those of compassion by treating all distresses as more picturesque than real. I don't see how it is at all possible for such a person to write great poetry. For a young and serious Englishman of 22, it seems is a pretty insightful and observation about himself. In the 1840s, he began to spend more and more time in Italy, in Switzerland, and in Italy, and in Venice, which he came to like a great deal. Then in 1841, he read a scathing attack on the great British painter Turner, and was very much upset, and in which Turner was taken to task for not living up to the standards of antiquity and living up to the standards of the greatest painting in the world, at which point he immediately embarked upon writing Volume 1 of his great book, Modern Painters, in which he suggested and argued in great detail the way that modern painting and landscape painting equaled and surpassed the painting of the ancients. Then immediately thereafter, in 1843, he published the first volume. 1846, he published the second volume, which dealt more and more with Italian painting, and he became involved in 15th century painting and an interest in that. The interesting thing about Ruskin's attitude toward, and Ruskin's writing about art, of course, is that Ruskin is not an academic. There's no such thing at that time as academic art writing. He had a very good education, nearly everything but German idealism, which probably not the worst thing that ever happened to him. His methodology derived very heavily from the two great influences of his youth, which is the scientific study of nature and the exegetical study of the Bible. And throughout his life, Ruskin managed to maintain this sort of bifocal attitude about nature, in which one read the fact of nature and the reality of nature and the significance of nature, and rather presumed that these two existed simultaneously. And his reading of paintings as portraying the world and portraying an idea about truth and beauty sustained him. In 1849, he embarked on another major sort of project of definition called the Seven Lamps of Architecture, in which we will talk about later. And then following that, in 1851, he published the first volume of the Stones of Venice, and then in 1853 he published volumes 2 and 3. The Stones of Venice was a detailed analysis, historical and technical and exegetical analysis of Venetian architecture. The motivation for it was, first of all, Ruskin's love of the Gothic, and most specifically of the Italian Gothic. Ruskin has been largely misrepresented as sort of a blunt enthusiast of all Gothic architecture, and if those of you that know the Italian Gothic will know that it is by far the most refined and thoughtful and gorgeous of Gothic architectures, and quite different from the Northern Gothic. But anyway, the Stones of Venice he took on the Stones of Venice as an idea to understand Venice, but also to understand the rise and fall of a great mercantile maritime culture. In other words, he was looking back at the rise and fall of Venice and of Venetian architecture as a way of trying to understand the culture that he lived in England, which is the third, as he says, the third great mercantile maritime culture after the Phoenicians and the Venetians and the English. And so this was the source of his of his quest, and it's important to know that Ruskin, as a critic, was never a pure critic. In other words, art for Ruskin was moral, morality for Ruskin was social, society for Ruskin had to do with culture. You could not, in Ruskin's view, talk about culture without considering art as its central concern, nor could you talk about art without addressing culture as its central concern. In other words, we're not talking about a formalist approach. 1854, Ruskin underwent an incredibly embarrassing and disastrous divorce, having had being married to a young lady who ran off with the painter John Millay, who was his best friend, Effie Ruskin. The marriage was annulled on the grounds of lack of consummation. Effie Ruskin was a beautiful woman, and this is the only thing I really don't understand about Ruskin, or that I have difficulty understanding. But anyway, in 1856 he published 2 subsequent volumes of Modern Painters, very much having to do with the analysis of the way that we look at pictures and the analysis of the way that art functions as a moral instrument. Then in 1858, he underwent a major spiritual crisis. He stopped believing not in God, but in the tenets of evangelical Christianity, and these tenets that he had always believed in, and whose ideas about the text and about the world had informed all of his criticism. Let me find the section here. Oh, excuse me. These are called books, by the way, for you younger people. They're a lot like magazines, but you can also use them for door stops and paperweights and things like this. They're like information storage systems. I'm an educator at heart. Anyway, this is Ruskin's narration of his loss of faith, which will give you an idea of this change. And he said, I was still in the bonds of my old evangelical faith, and in 1858 it was with me, Protestantism or nothing. The crisis of the whole turn of my thoughts being one Sunday morning at Turin, when from before Paul Veronese's Queen of Sheba and under quite overwhelmed sense of his God-given power, I went away to a Waldensian chapel where a little squeaking idiot was preaching to an audience of 17 old women in 3 louts that they were the only children of God in Turin, and that all the people in Turin outside the chapel and all the people in the world out of the sight of Monte Viso would be damned. I came out of that chapel in some of 20 years' thought, a conclusively that is, he expresses himself very lucidly on this. Was this enormous crisis in Ruskin's life and led to coming subsequently upon his divorce and the crisis surrounding that. So as a result, the final volume of Modern Painters was the darkest and most dread of all the pictures, and he returned to his great subject that he had started with, Turner, and reinterpreted Turner in a more complex light as a poet of dissolution and of decay and of classical disaster. Also at this time, having abandoned his faith in the afterlife, and never, I should be clear, Ruskin is never an irreligious man. He is a profoundly religious thinker. He is a theological thinker in the sense that a lot of Marxist thinkers are theological. That is the relentless movement to some sort of theological order, never abandoned him. But as he began to turn away from evangelical Christianity, he began to turn his critical gaze upon the conditions of Victorian capitalism, and at this time he wrote a series of lectures called Unto This Last, and which actually amounted to a total disaster in his career. The magazine which he had funded to publish these things was ultimately run out of business. The essays were not actually published in their entirety until much later. He continued to lecture and continued. At this time, Ruskin had become pretty much one of the gods of Victorian criticism, basically on the severe sort of Protestant underpinning of his earlier writing. Having abandoned that, of course, the public abandoned him to a certain extent, but he was still to the elite and to the intelligentsia a very important man. In 1879, he was appointed the first Slade Professor of Art at Oxford. In 1869, excuse me. In 1879, and all during from 1869 until the end of his life, he suffered intermittent bouts of madness and disorientation and confusion and despair. He developed a severe attachment on a young lady 30 years his younger named Rose Latouche, who herself died in insanity, and continued, as he had all of his life, to develop fixations on younger women, for which I don't see any reason. You know. But in 1879, strangely enough, in one of his erratic moods, he attacked Whistler, as he put it, for flinging a paint pot in the face of the British public. A very strange response for a man who had spent his life defending Turner, who had flung a few paint pots in his time. Whistler sued Turner and won. And after this time, until 1900, when he died, he was momentarily lucid and continued to write and wrote his biography, continued to amass his collected works, which I managed to get in San Diego for $150, 57 volumes. But to give you an idea of his stature when he died, though, I'd like to read you a couple of statements on that occasion. In 1900, Oscar Wilde died that year, too. Excuse me. This is Leo Tolstoy. Ruskin was one of the most remarkable men, not only of England in our time, but of all countries and all times. He was one of those rare men who thinks with their hearts, and so he thought and said not only what he himself had seen and felt, but what everyone will think and say in the future. Marcel Proust, another one of Ruskin's serious and long-time devotees and translator, as a matter of fact. When I see how mightily this dead man lives, I know how slight a thing death is. So to go and to talk about Ruskin's work, the difficulty, and there are a number of what critics would say the problem with Ruskin. The problem with Ruskin, of course, is first of all is his insistence upon the morality of vision. The problem with Ruskin is that he was concerned absolutely with issues that had to do with beauty and with quality. He would write in Modern Painters that the difference between mean and great art lies not in definable methods of handling or styles of representations or choices of subjects, but wholly in the nobleness of the end to which the effort of the painter is addressed, which I will admit sounds a little recherché, but, 3 or 4 years ago I was talking to Ed Richet about a particular artist and whether we liked him or not, and Ed said in his own way exactly the same thing. He says, I have no problem with the quality of the work. I have serious problems with the quality of the job. And Ruskin's emphasis always was specifically with this, was not so much with the quality of the work, but with the quality of the job. Out of the body of his work, which as I said is some 57 volumes, we have a whole series of critical terminology and language that we use. The whole concept of Ruskin is probably the first one to consider the idea of difference as being more critical than likeness in painting. You'd say that it is to raise the issue that it is the difference between nature and the work of art that speaks to us, that the likeness is simply the occasion for that difference, and that difference, of course, is the measure of its significance. You French crit people will perhaps recognize that from somewhere. It was Ruskin who first introduced the criticism of the pathetic fallacy, the idea of imposing the emotions of man upon the portrayal of nature. He introduced to us the first serious discussions of the innocence or lack of innocence of the eye, of trying to see what one sees rather than to see what one knows is there. A fairly serious issue. Talking to you as architects, what I would like to start off with, just as a place to start off with, and in 57 volumes of beautiful prose, I was thinking, I taught a course in 14 meetings here on the Bible a couple of years ago. This is easily as complex and as shallow an approach to the same task. But as architects, I'll introduce you to Ruskin's primary heresy, insofar as I can. This is from the introduction to the Seven Lamps of Architecture. Architecture is the art which so disposes and adorns the edifices raised by man for whatsoever uses, that the sight of them contributes to his mental health, power, and pleasure. It is very necessary at the outset of all inquiry to distinguish carefully between architecture and building. To build, literally to confirm, is by common understanding to put together and adjust the several pieces of any edifice or receptacle of considerable size. Thus we have church building, house building, ship building, coach building. That one edifice stands, another floats, and another is suspended on iron springs makes no difference to the nature of that art. So if so it may be called, to the art of building or edification. The persons who profess that art are severally builders, ecclesiastical or naval, or whatever other name their work may justify. But building does not become architecture merely by the stability of what it erects. It is no more architecture which raises a church or fits it to receive and contain the comfort of the required number of persons occupied in certain religious offices than it is architecture that makes a carriage commodious or a ship swift. Thus, I suppose that, no one will call the laws architectural which determine the height of a breastwork or the position of a bastion, but if to the stone facing of that bastion be added an unnecessary feature as a cable molding, that is architecture. It would be similarly unreasonable to call the battlements or architectural features, so long as they consist only of an advanced gallery supported on projecting masses with open intervals beneath for offense. But if these projecting masses be carved beneath into rounded courses which are useless, and if the headings of the intervals be arched and trefoiled, which is useless, that is architecture. It may not be always easy to draw the line so sharply and so simply, because there are so few buildings which have not some presence of color and of being architectural. Neither can there be any architecture which is not based on building, nor any good architecture which is not based on good building, but it is perfectly easy and necessary to keep the ideas distinct. and to understand fully that architecture concerns itself only with those characters of an edifice which are above and beyond its common use. I say common, because a building raised to the honor of God or in the memory of man has surely a use to which its architectural adornment fits it, but not a use which limits by any inevitable necessities its plans or details. Now, Ruskin goes on at length, and we will go on at length to talk about this idea, and of course this is the one heresy which confuses nearly all modern architects, but it is based on a fairly complex sets of arguments. First of all, it's based on an idea that there is a difference between nature and culture, that there is a difference between materials and language, that a work of architecture is material, and that it is language that it is composed of material nature, and it is also composed of material of significant organizations and symbols. Finally, it has to do with this distinction, which is that the world of nature, conceptualized, deals with what Ruskin calls the world that we know is there, and that the world of language and of significance of what he calls architecture deals with the world that we can see. In other words, the world that we can see, we signify. The world that we know is there, we conceptualize. And these are different activities for Ruskin. Now, this is, and we'll go on and I'll talk about some other ideas. This is one of Ruskin's great critiques of a particular realist painter. So the problem with this painter is that he paints what he knows is there. He doesn't paint what he sees. And it is in that act of signifying vision that everything becomes important for Ruskin. Here's Ruskin on the issue of functionalism. It's an essay called The Flamboyant Architecture in the Valley of the Somme. It's in 1869. The builder's mind was far too busy in other and higher directions to care about construction. His mind is full of theology, of philosophy, of thoughts about fate, about love, about death, about heaven and hell. It is not at all an interesting question with him how to make stones balance each other, but it is how to reconcile doctrines. The center of gravity of the vaults is of little moment with him, but the center of fortitude and spirits is much. Not but that his arches and stones, however rudely balanced, did stick together somehow. There is no defiance of construction in them, only no attention is paid to it. If the thing stands, that is all that is wanted. But I think you must see at once that what a vital difference it must make at last to schools of building, whether their designer had his head full of mathematical puzzles or of eager passions, whether he is only a dexterous joiner manufacturing hollow stone boxes, or a poet writing his book on the pages of marble, not caring much about the binding of them. If the thing stands, that is all that is wanted. Now, what he goes on to discuss in this essay, which I think is fairly interesting, is not that architecture, that this significant nature of architecture is desirable. Ruskin goes on and argues that it is unavoidable that functionalism, insofar as it exists, is itself a doctrine. That, in other words, that there's no way to take doctrine out of architecture, and that not to impose a doctrine, a humane doctrine on architecture, is to leave it with the doctrine of function, and the doctrine of function, of course, is the source of a lot of Ruskin's anger. And what Ruskin does with nearly all of his arguments is he turns it back on the maker, turns it back on what these doctrines mean to man, so that to make architecture into a tool is to make man into a tool. As he says, the division of labor has nothing to do with the division of labor. It has to do with the division of men. To make a building which is to a tool is to make men into a tool, to simplify them and to reduce them. Now, what Ruskin, the great argument, the great source that Ruskin found for his arguments about the distinction between architecture and building, of course, was in the Gothic. Now, what Ruskin found in the Gothic, of course, and all of us would recognize this is not the real Gothic. He found his own Gothic. He found the source for his arguments of what he wanted to say about how men should make architecture. As you can see from what I'm saying here, the arguments that Ruskin makes are based in a lot of simultaneous doctrines. Certainly Marx, who is writing about the same subjects at the same time, develops a lot of these same arguments, specifically about the division of labor and the sources of value in labor. What Marxist critics found in the projected dictatorship of the proletariat, of course, Ruskin, a more conservative temper, found in the Gothic revival. So when Ruskin writes the Stones of Venice, this analytical, typological theory of architecture in a better age, it has real analogy, strangely enough, with Walter Benjamin's famous arcade project. Walter Benjamin, the famous German theoretician and aesthetician in the 20s and 30s, who undertook an enormous project of analyzing the arcades, the commercial arcades of Paris in the mid-19th century as a symbolic universe in which all of capitalist culture was embodied and signified simultaneously, a kind of archaeology of capitalism. What Ruskin did was to go back to Venice and to use the Venetian world for basically the same kind of analysis. Ruskin and Benjamin have a great deal in common. They're both heavily dialectical and historicist thinkers. They are people who believed absolutely in the moral nature of the visual and the importance of interpreting it, and of basing their generalizations on actually what can be seen. Both of them share the idea that all value derives from labor, and Ruskin's great task is, because he says, is to translate labor into work. Labor is degrading, work is ennobling, as he said, and to reduce the theft of capitalism. As Ruskin says, he says, we are all told to buy cheap and sell high. To buy cheap, anything cheap, is to sell some man's, steal some man's labor. He's probably the first critic who would seriously and relentlessly ask the question about art that we find ourselves asking over and over again today. When you say something is good, the next question is, good for what and good for who? And these are the questions that Ruskin asks over and over again in the face of fashion as he remains. I'd like to read you some sections from the Stones of Venice. It's from a section in Volume 2 of the Stones of Venice called The Nature of the Gothic. I'll just read you the introduction here, because just to give you an idea of Ruskin's habits of mind. He said, I believe in that the character or moral elements of the Gothic are the following, placed in the order of their importance. First, savageness. 2, changefulness. 3, naturalism, by which he distinguished from realism. 4, grotesqueness. 5, rigidity. 6, redundance. These characters here are expressed as belonging to the building. As belonging to the builder, they would be expressed as savageness or rudeness, as love of change, as love of nature, as disturbed imagination, as obstinacy, as generosity. Now, it is this habit, as I say, that Ruskin, of turning it back, turning the description of the building back onto what it says about the builder and the people it uses, that is Ruskin's habit that I think is what is most lost to us. In other words, when he says the division of labor is the division of men, when he says if a work of art has these elements and we describe and value them, then we're valuing these elements in men. To take the classic example, let me see. I remember when I was in school, and thank God you don't hear this anymore, I was always told less is more. You remember that? We always kept being told less is more. And as a matter of fact, this was appropriated by modern architects from Robert Browning, who meant something very different from it. Robert Browning used the term in Andrea del Sarto to talk about the way that less technique let more of the subject through in a representation, that the way that less handling and control on the part of the artist liberated the subject. As it was used in modern architecture, it's considerably different. But when people told us less is more, nobody said, does that mean that the few are more better than the many? You know, does that mean that that one person is all people, that one decision is all things, that one object is many objects? What does this mean? But is this reflexive habit, again, that was sort of canceled out of the world with modernist architecture, as was the distinction and the assumption that works of architecture exist in material and exist in significance. I know when I was in school, I'm sure this is all old hat to you, I was told that the idea of architecture, of course, that the ideal was to fit the architecture into its natural environment so that you could have a house, and see how the hill comes up there and the stream flows down here and the building fits right in. And the presumption, of course, is that human beings were creatures of nature, like my beagle, and therefore that if this building fit into the hill, that if this building fit into the stream, it was just going to be great for a lawyer to live in, because of course he had the same needs and language and everything as the stream and the hill and land. But it is this distinction that Ruskin makes against about architecture as human significance and building as a natural activity that enables us to critique that particular, what I consider to be one of the more ludicrous aspects of modernist architecture. I mean, the whole idea that if you fit something into nature, you're fitting it into culture seems profoundly distressful and doesn't encourage anything but the sale of rugs. But I would like to go on here to a section of some detail and give to the crux of what Ruskin is arguing here. And he's talking about ornament. In the 13th and 14th paragraphs of chapter 21 of the first volume of this work, he can remember that, it was noticed that the systems of architectural ornament, properly so called, might be divided into three: servile ornament, in which the execution or power of the inferior workman is entirely subjected to the intellect of the higher; constitutional ornament, in which the executive inferior power is to a certain point emancipated and independent, having a will of its own, yet confessing its inferiority and rendering obedience to higher powers; and finally, revolutionary ornament, in which no executive inferiority is admitted at all. I must here explain the nature of the divisions at somewhat greater length. Of servile ornament, the principal schools are the Greek, the Ninevite, and the Egyptian, but their civilities of different kinds. The Greek master workman was far advanced in his knowledge and power above the Assyrian and the Egyptians. Neither he nor those for whom he worked could endure the appearance of imperfection in anything, and therefore what ornament he appointed to be done by those beneath him was composed of mere geometrical forms, balls, ridges, perfectly symmetrical foliage, which could be executed with absolute precision by line and rule, and which were perfect in their way when completed as his own figure sculptor. The Assyrian and Egyptian, on the contrary, less cognizant of accurate form in anything, were content to allow their figure sculptors to be executed by inferior workmen, but lowered the method of its treatment to a standard which every workman could reach, and then trained him by discipline so rigid that there was no chance of his falling beneath the standard appointed. The Greek gave the lower workman no subject which he could not perfectly execute. The Assyrian gave him subjects which he could only execute imperfectly, but fixed a legal standard for his imperfection. The workman was in both cases a slave. But in the medieval and especially the Christian systems of ornament, this slavery is done away with altogether. Christianity, having recognized in small things as well as great the individual value of every soul, but it not only recognizes its value, it confesses its imperfection, in only bestowing dignity upon the acknowledgement of unworthiness. That admission of lost power and fallen nature, which the Greek and the Ninevite felt to be intensely painful, and as far as might be altogether refused, the Christian makes daily and hourly, contemplating the fact of it without fear, and tending in the end to God's greater glory. Therefore, to every spirit which Christianity summons to her service, her exhortation is, do what you can and confess frankly what you are unable to do. Neither let your effort be shortened for fear of failure, nor your confession silenced for fear of shame. It is perhaps the principal admirableness of the Gothic schools of architecture that they thus receive the results of labor of inferior minds, and out of the fragments full of imperfection, and betraying that imperfection in every touch, indulgently raise up a stately and unexcusable whole. But the modern English mind has this much in common with that of the Greek, that it intensely desires in all things the utmost completion or perfection compatible with their nature. This is a noble character in the abstract, but it comes ignoble when it causes us to forget the relative dignities of the nature itself and to prefer the perfectness of the lower nature to the imperfection of the higher. And therefore, while in all things that we see or do we are to desire perfection and strive for it, we are nevertheless not to set meaner things the meaner things in its narrow accomplishment above the nobler things in their mighty progress. We are not to esteem smooth minuteness over shattered majesty, not to prefer mean victory over honorable feat, not to lower the level of our aim that we may the more surely enjoy the complacency of success. But above all, in our dealing with the souls of other men, we're to take care how we check by severe requirements or narrow caution efforts which might otherwise lead to noble issue, and still more how we withhold our admiration from great excellences because they are mingled with rough faults. Now in the make and nature of every man, however rude and simple, whom we employ in manual labor, there are some powers for better things, some tardy imagination, some torpid capacity for emotion, tottering steps of thought. There are even at their worst. And in most cases, it is all our own fault that they are so tardy or torpid. But they cannot be strengthened unless we are content to take them in their feebleness, unless we prize and honor them in their imperfection above the best and the most perfect manual skill. And this is what we have to do with all of our laborers, to look for the thoughtful part of them, to get out of them whatever we lose for it, whatever faults or errors we are obliged to take with it. For the best that is in them cannot be manifest but in the company of much error. Understand this clearly. You can teach a man to draw a straight line and to cut one, to strike a curved line and to carve it, and to copy and to carve any number of given lines and forms with admirable speed and perfect precision. You can find his work perfect of its kind, but if you ask him about any of these forms to consider it, if he cannot find anything better in his own head, he stops. His execution becomes hesitating. He thinks, and 10 to 1 he thinks wrong. 10 to 1 he makes a mistake in the first touch, and the first touch he gives to his work is thinking being. But you have made him a man for all that. He was only a machine before, an animated tool, and observed. You are put to a stern choice in this matter. You must either make a tool of the creature or make a man of him. You cannot make both. And this is the basic premise of Ruskin's argument about the nature of the Gothic. And it derives, of course, from this basic idea that how can you erect an honorable structure, an edifice, which degrades the people that construct it, which turns them into machines. How can you construct such an edifice that degrades the people that construct it and not degrade the people that inhabit it? And this, I think, is still, as we all know, a crucial issue for all people that build and think to design. To go on, that is, I'm skipping a section here, with this division between concept and labor. We're always in these days endeavoring to separate the two. We want one man to always be thinking and another to always be working. We call one a gentleman and the other an operative. Whereas the workman ought to be thinking and the thinker ought to be working, and both should be gentlemen in the best sense. As it is, we make both of them ungentle, the one envying the other despising his brother. And the mass of society is made up of morbid thinkers and miserable workers. Now it is only by their labor, now it is only by their labor that the thought can be made healthy, and only by thought that the labor can be made happy, and the two cannot be separated with impunity. But the principle may be stated more broadly still. I have confined the illustration to architecture, but I must not leave it true to architecture only. Hitherto I've used the words imperfect and perfect, merely to distinguish between work grossly unskillful and work executed with average precision in science. I've been pleading that any degree of unskillfulness should be admitted, so only that the laborer's mind has room for expression. But accurately speaking, no good work whatever can be perfect, and the demand for perfection is always a sign of misunderstanding of the ends of art. This is for two reasons, based on everlasting laws. First, no great man ever stops working till he has reached his point of failure. Now skip this here. The second reason is that imperfection is in some sort essential to all that we know of life. It is the sign of life in the moral body, that is to say, the state of progress and change. Nothing that lives or can be is rigidly perfect. Part of it is decaying, part of it is nascent. The foxglove blossom, a third part bud, a third part past, a third part in full bloom, is a type of the life in this world. And in all things that live, there are certain irregularities and deficiencies which are not only signs of life but sources of beauty. No human face is exactly the same as in the lines on each side. No leaf perfect in its load, no branch in symmetry. All admit irregularity. All of them imply change. To banish imperfection is to destroy expression, to check exertion, to paralyze vitality. All things are literally better, lovely, and more beloved for their imperfections, which may be divinely appointed, which may have been divinely appointed. That the law of human life may be effort, and the law of human judgment may be mercy. Now, this is a little more complicated argument than it sounds. And by the way, it's very interesting, that line there. I was recently in Texas, and I was talking to a refugee, Nicaraguan refugee, who was up here, and we were talking about living in America after living many years in Nicaragua in a very violent situation. And he was talking to me, we were just talking about America, and he said, the thing about America is that America is so tough. He's coming from Nicaragua. I was asking what he meant. He says, America has no idea of mercy. There's no concept of mercy in American society. There's no concept of loss. But what Ruskin is arguing here is, excuse me, let me find my place here, has to do with two things, and he goes on to argue them at some length. First of all, he's making this distinction between building and architecture again, saying building has to do with concept and material. It exists at a single point in time. You build a building considering your conception of it, considering the strength of the materials as they exist. Architecture, on the other hand, admits of imperfection, and as a result, architecture can live. Architecture, as Ruskin defines it, can get old. It can age. It can even immediately fall down, as Ruskin talks about walking through the ruins of the Roman Forum. I said it was an amazing place. There was not a building there, but the place was full of architecture. If you understand what he's saying. But he's talking about that element of architecture which allows the building to survive, allows it to change, allows it to decay, allows it ultimately to fall down. In other words, allows it to survive the strength of the materials as they give away and the solidity of the concept, but to live in that sense. And to deny that is to place us, is to deny the past. And this, he develops an argument about this idea in architecture that is very similar to the one that Walter Benjamin makes about the nature of fashion. Benjamin is talking about the invention of fashion as a weapon against death, in the sense that you change fashions, you update fashions. We live in a world in which everything is new every day, that the newness of every day destroys the past. By destroying the past, you destroy age, you destroy development. You make it possible to live in this perpetual steady state of novelty in the present, and to deny that there is death until it finally hits you, and to make it impossible for a culture or society to grow, because the idea of novelty and fashion stops us in that one place where everything is new every day and the past is lost every morning. And this is implicit. And again, you have to understand, Ruskin is writing all of this at the beginning of the modern era. He doesn't have the virtue of hindsight. I'd like to read just one more section here before I move on. Ruskin on style change. Y'all know about that? It's from an essay on the role of the imagination in architecture. Perhaps the first idea that a young architect is apt to be allured by is a head-on problem in these experimental days. Is it's being incumbent upon him to invent a new style worthy of modern civilization in general, and of England in particular, a style worthy of our engines and our telegraphs, as expansive as steam, as sparkling as electricity. But if there are any of my hearers who have been impressed with this sense of inventive duty, may I ask them first whether their plan is that every inventive architect among us shall invent a new style for himself, or have a county set aside for his conceptions, or a province for his practice, or must every architect invent a little piece of a new style and put it all together at last like a dissected map? And if so, when this new style is invented, what is to be done next? I will grant that this Eldorado you this Eldorado of the imagination, but can you have more than one Columbus? And if you sail in the company and divide the prize of your discovery and the honor thereof, who is to come after these clustered Columbus? To what fortuitous islands of style are your architectural descendants to sail, avaricious of new lands? When our desired style is invented, will it not be the best that we can? Excuse me, I'm having a little trouble with these lines here. When our desired architectural style is invented, will not the best we can do be simply to build in it? And cannot you do that now in styles that are already known? Observe, I grant for the sake of argument that perhaps many of you know that I would not grant otherwise, that a new style can be invented. I grant you not only this, but that it shall be wholly different from any style that was ever practiced before. We will suppose that the capitals are on the bottom of the pillars instead of on the top. The buttresses shall be on the tops of the pinnacles instead of at the bottom. That you roof your apertures with stone, which is neither arched nor horizontal. That you compose your decoration of lines that shall be neither crooked nor straight. The furnace and the forge shall be at your service. You shall be able to draw out your plates of glass and beat your bars of iron till you have encompassed us all. If your style be of the practical kind, with endless perspective of black skeleton and blinding square, or if your style be of the ideal kind, you shall wreathe your streets with ductile leafage and roof them with variegated crystal. You shall put, if you will, all London under one blazing dome of many colors, and shall light the clouds round it with its flashing as far as to the sea. And still I ask you, what after this? Do you suppose those imaginations of yours will ever lie down there asleep beneath the shade of your iron leafage, or beneath the colored light of your enchanted dome? Not so. Those souls and fashions and ambitions of yours are wholly infinite, and whatever may be done by others, you'll still want to do something for yourselves. If you cannot rest content with Palladio, neither will you rest content with Paxton. All the metal and glass that will ever be melted will be not so much weight in them as will clog the wings of one human spirit's aspiration. And it seems to me it's fairly interesting, because Ruskin right here goes right to the heart of the difficulty of the whole rhetoric of stylistic innovation, is that it perpetually succeeds itself and it perpetually destroys the past that existed before it. And unless you presume that we're all going in some healthy, complex direction, then these are real issues. I think these are interesting issues, and especially very interesting to be being raised in the 1850s. He goes on to say, and again, here's Ruskin turning it back upon the builder and back upon the architect, observe that nearly every other liberal art or profession has some intense pleasure connected with it, irrespective of its good to others. As lawyers or physicians or clergymen, you would have the pleasure of investigation, of historical reading as part of your work. As men of science, you would be rejoicing in curiosity, perpetually gratified respecting the laws and the facts of nature. As artists, you would have the delight in watching the external forms of the world. But your architectural designing leads into no pleasant journeys, into seeing no such lovely things, no discerning of just laws, no warmths of compassion, no humilities of veneration, no progressive state of sight or soul. Our conclusion must be that you will not amuse, inform, nor help anybody. You will not amuse nor better or inform yourselves. You will sink into a state in which you can neither show nor feel nor see anything, but that 1 is to 2 is 3 is to 6. And in that state, what should we call ourselves? Men? I think not. The right name for us would be numerators, or denominators, or vulgar fractions. May we not begin to accept this great principle that as our bodies be to health, as our bodies to be in health must be general exercise, so our minds to be in health must be generally cultivated. You could not call a man healthy who had strong arms but was paralytic in his feet, nor one who could walk well but had no use of his hands, nor one who could see well but could not hear. You would not voluntarily reduce your bodies to any such partially developed state. I realize this makes no sense to us here in the land of the bicep and the breast, but this is what we're talking about. He goes on to say that there are various aspects of the architectural trade which, if you do not use, you cripple. One is curiosity. This is a gift, capacity for pleasure in knowing that which if you destroy, you make yourself dull. The other is sympathy, the power of sharing in that feeling of living creatures that if you destroy, you make yourself hard. The other of your limbs, your mind, is admiration, the power of enjoying beauty or ingenuity, which if you destroy, you make yourself base and irreverent. The other is wit, the power of playing with the lights on many sides of the truth, which is if you destroy, you'll make yourself gloomy. This may sound very obvious and very, very straightforward, but the practice I have found in both art and architecture schools of sympathy, admiration, curiosity, and wit are pretty much the basic things that go as one introduces style change, ambition, and ideology. And I think that Ruskin probably is fairly close to something in this area. Excuse me. Now, I think you can see, and I think what's important to when you're talking about the way that Ruskin looks at the world and the way that I have been talking about him looking at the world, is that he approaches the world dialectically, of course. He tends to see darkness and light opposed, good and evil opposed, the carved and the flat, the reflective and the absorptive, all of these issues. What makes Ruskin's thought most interesting and most complicated and what I would say most contemporary is that it derives, and as you've probably been able to see, I wish I could have read these better, from a fairly intricate application of these antinomies. And the way Ruskin described the way he looked at the world was that he looked at the world, he said, with an intellectual lens and with a moral retina. What this means is that the traditional way of addressing the world of type and dialectic is to look at the world and to associate those moral issues with plastic antinomies that exist in the world. The simplest example, to associate good and evil with hot and cold, with red and green, with whatever sort of complementary or antonyms that you want to do. What Ruskin's habit, very simply, is to go to the world, again, and to see it in all of its plastic dialectics between near and far, between bright and dark, between rough and smooth, and then, secondarily, to come to it with the decisions that divide it yet again along another axis. And again, this is Walter Benjamin. Divide it then yet again along the axis that distinguishes between what is good, what is nurturing, and what is violent, so that one does not approach simply to say dark is good, you see, and light is bad, or vice versa. One says the world divides itself into light and dark, and those positive aspects of the light are this, and those negative aspects of the light are that. And those positive aspects of the dark are this, and those negative aspects of the dark the dark are this. In other words, it is a very complex sort of double dialectic, and it is a way of seeing the world, again, perpetually, reflexively, so that what you look at, what you characterize, you always allow to characterize yourself, that what you say about an object reflects upon what you say about yourself, that it always reflects your values, that the buildings you build change the people that build them, change the people that live within them. And this particular attitude, that is what it is, it's an attitude which, as you know, I'll just give you Ruskin's deep structure here. The idea of traditional idea at that time of perception had to do with the idea of concept, which is static in the head, and precept, which is the world as it hits the retina. Ruskin thought and insisted upon in a dialectic between this intellectual lens and this moral retina at the level of theory and not at the level of concept. And what turns it, for me, and makes it so interesting, is that I do not think that this attitude about the way that we make buildings or the way that we make art is articulable without a deep-seated presumption that art and architecture does something good, and that its good use is somehow related to what is beautiful, that what we see. And assuming that these, let's assume for a moment, this is just a construct. But unless you operate with this construct, then you really have no language of characterization with which to work. And so what I'm proposing to you is that we come from, that is, distinguish what Ruskin does from what we do, is that we come from such a very serious, critical tradition. We come from a tradition that says a good fit is the absence of misfits. In other words, that something is right when there is nothing left wrong with it. I'm not objecting to this, it's a pretty good procedure. But that we never really think about those basic intentions. We think about the quality of the work, we think about the design, but we don't so much think about the job. And if you're going to think about the job, then you can't think about what you hate, and you can't think about what you hate without thinking about what you love. You can't think about what's ugly without thinking about what's beautiful, unless if you take the view that Ruskin takes, so that some idea of beauty and some idea of positive function has to be generated. And I'm not suggesting, as Ruskin does, that this is an objective concept. But I'm saying that unless all of us try to develop a concept of what positively we absolutely think is beautiful, and how we make a concept of what is beautiful or what is good that does not degrade in a building the people that build it or the people that live in it in the process of making it so, unless we really consider this as a positive source of intellectual activity, we're only really working with half the tools that are at our disposal. We're offering the critique, we're finding out, we're eliminating everything that's wrong, and we're assuming, and I think incorrectly, that what's left will be right. I think basically what you can say is if we eliminate everything that's wrong, what's left will be okay. Yeah, if you understand what I mean. We can hope that maybe someday it'll be pretty good. Then I realize that I'm presenting to you a very antique and a very odd view of making art, but I am presenting to you habits of mind that derive that begin in Ruskin that very much inform contemporary thinking about aesthetics. And I do that, first of all, to say that Ruskin was a great man. Second of all, for you to begin to understand that critical ideas about deconstruction, critical ideas that have to do with reader response or viewer response, really have their basis in a moral view of the universe. Otherwise, these activities would be ultimately, they would have no motivation, no beginning, at least in my point of view. Now, just by way of conclusion here, I would like to read you a section that Ruskin wrote at the end of Modern Painters as a kind of valedictory that pretty much sums up his position. All that is involved in these passionate utterances of my youth was first expanded and then concentrated into the aphorism, all great art is praise. And on that aphorism, the yet bolder saying founded, so far from art's being immoral, in the ultimate power of it, nothing but art is moral. Life without industry is sin. Industry without art is brutality. And now, in writing beneath the cloudless peace of the snows of Chamonix, what must be the really final works of this book, which their beauty inspired and their strength guided, I am able with yet happier and calmer heart than ever heretofore to enforce its simple assurance of faith that the knowledge of what is beautiful leads on and is the first step to the knowledge of things which are lovely and of good report, and that the laws, the life, and the joy of beauty in the material world are as eternal and sacred parts of his creation as in the world of spirits virtue and in the world of angels praise. Now basically, if you can write a sentence like that, I don't care what you say. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Do you have any questions? I probably can't answer them, but I'll be glad to. Aren't there ever any questions? Okay, thank you very much for coming, and I told you it was going to be boring, so what the hell. Thank you.